Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. Specifically, I want to thank her for her recent rather incredible contribution of $10 million. $10 million to our endowment fund, plus another pledge of up to $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you have a little change to spare, the Leon Levy Foundation will match your grant up to an amount of $5 million. You can talk to me after this event to get further details. Please note that our next event will be on Tuesday, October 8th at 6:30 p.m. when Cynthia Carr, a former Leon Levy Fellow, will be discussing her biography of Candy Darling with Lucy Sante. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so you can be notified of our future events. But tonight I am delighted to welcome Max Boot yet again to discuss his new biography of Ronald Reagan. Max is a columnist for the Washington Post, a fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the author of numerous books, including The Road Not Taken, a biography of Edward Lansdale, which was a New York Times bestseller, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Biography, and The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right. I note that Max's esteemed Liverite Norton editor is here, Robert Wheel, editor of many biographies. So Max and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our in-person audience. This event is being live streamed, so hello out there to our virtual audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. And thanks again to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Thank you. Max, let's talk about your Ronald Reagan.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. So I want to begin with a little bit about your own political trajectory. Why did you leave the right? And I ask this because I like to tease biographers that, we are actually, it's a profession that is subjective. We can't possibly be objective, and we bring to our life writing our own prejudices and biases, and we're not novelists, but we're similar to novelists. I like to tease biographers.
Hopefully not too similar.
Yeah. Well, there's a major
Edmund
difference.
Morris was a little bit too similar to a novelist.
Exactly. Unlike novelists, we have footnotes. And
he actually made up footnotes, which is that's some crazy, you know what.
So tell us about why did you leave the right and how that impacted your writing of this book.
Well, that's a very simple and unsurprising answer. The reason why I left the right, it's a two-word answer, and those two words are Donald Trump. Since I re-registered the day after the 2016 election, but having done so, it also put me into a kind of reflective mode of thinking like, wow, how did the right wind up in this crazy place where it was under Trump and remains under Trump? And it made me think about what are the historical antecedents and origins and what are the differences and similarities and all that kind of stuff. Now, I'd actually, by the time the 2016 election occurred, I had actually already signed up to do this book in 2013. So when I did it, I certainly had no thoughts about Donald Trump, because at that point it would have seemed farcical to suggest that this, bombastic real estate developer and TV host could possibly be President of the United States, although I suppose I should have known better, given that I was signing up to write a book about somebody else who had been the host of a nationally televised show before becoming president. But I certainly did not have Trump in mind when I wrote this book, and he's certainly not a major character or theme in the book, although I do very briefly at the beginning and end examine the question of to what extent Reagan led to Trump. But I think, the advent of Donald Trump, which was very bad for the country and the world, was probably good for me from a biographical standpoint because, if I were writing this book in the mode of somebody who was a Republican and somebody who was, an active Ronald Reagan fan, it probably wouldn't have been a great book. And there's a lot of books like that. And it certainly would not have occupied a unique niche because there's a lot of books by Reagan fans out there, and if you want one of those, you can go pick it up. But I was trying to do something different and to write something that was truly objective, balanced, and that gave both the bad as well as the good and the strengths as well as the weaknesses. And I think I was really helped in doing that because I no longer, so to speak, had a dog in the hunt, and I becoming a political independent, I think really helped me as a biographer because it gave me kind of a distance and a neutrality and a more objective approach to my subject.
So I have a confession. Before I tackled a biography of Jimmy Carter, I was seriously thinking of doing Ronald Reagan. And I tried to talk my late co-author Martin Sherwin into this, and he wouldn't hear of it. So I went out to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in California. This must have been in 2010 or something.
I hope you brought a warm coat because the reading room is way over air conditioned.
It's way over air conditioned. And I spent 2 weeks there, and I got more and more depressed day by day. I just, at the thought of spending years on Ronald Reagan, he seemed, to be an empty vessel. And there wasn't much writing. He worked hard on his speeches, but there weren't a lot of memos back and forth, like I'd seen in the Kennedy Library, for instance. And so I gave up on the notion. And then in 2017, when I came here to the Biography Center, I ran in at a dinner party to Edmund Morris. And I walked up to Edmund and I sort of, I congratulated him on Dutch. I said, it is to this day, up to this moment, it's the best book we have on Ronald Reagan. And I understand why you made up a fictional character, because he was sort of an empty vessel, right? And Edmund looked at me and he said, I'm sorry you feel that way.
I talked to Edmund when I was writing this book. He was an odd bird, I will say, although a gifted writer.
He was a very odd biographer. His last biography on Thomas Edison, he wrote backwards.
Yeah, it was like the Benjamin Button book, right?
It was incredible, and I think he was the authorized biographer. He was sitting in the White House meetings.
No, Edmund had an amazing opportunity. There are not a lot of presidents who have authorized biographers who are allowed in, behind closed doors in the White House. And basically, I don't know what went wrong with him, but something went deeply wrong. So, his missed opportunity created my opportunity.
Right. So I noticed early in the book you actually quote Margaret Thatcher saying the same thing, coming out of her first meeting with Reagan, saying there's nothing there. So coming back to Morris's attempt, how do you think your book is different from what Edmund did, aside from the fictional character?
Well, that's kind of a big difference, since I don't inject myself as a character in Reagan's life. Edmund's book was okay. I don't mean to knock a fellow Reagan biographer here, but I will knock a fellow Reagan biographer here. It was deeply weird. He did some good research, and especially because writing as he was in the 80s and 90s, he was actually able to talk to some of Reagan's contemporaries from childhood. People that he went to school with at Eureka College and even high school and so forth. And he did some interesting research especially on Reagan's early life, I think. But I think one of his difficulties was he had a stunning lack of interest in American politics and policy in general. So he had very little on the presidency. And part of that also may be due to the fact that he was writing so close to the presidency. So it was very hard to get any kind of objective historical perspective on events that had happened only just a few years before. But he didn't really show much interest. He had all this access and wrote very little about what actually happened in the presidency and didn't really put Reagan into into the context of American political and cultural history. So there were a lot of problems beyond the fictionalization of that, that he did with that book. But I mean, he certainly had some interesting psychological and other insights. I think one key advantage I had over Edmund was I never got to interview Ronald Reagan. And I think part of what drove Edmund mad, if I can characterize it that way, was what drove so many reporters and other historians and people who, even his own speechwriters, who tried to interview him and get insights out of him. Peggy Noonan actually had this experience when she was writing his farewell address and hoped to make it really personal and really hoped to get some self-reflection and some deep thoughts from Reagan about his 8 years in the White House. And it was just an exercise in frustration because he was just not self-reflective, and he would just dredge up the same anecdotes and stories, and once you've heard them like 6 times, you don't want to hear them a 7th time. So I think it drove Edmund nuts that he couldn't, he wanted, to sit like this with Reagan and get Reagan to reflect on his life, and Reagan was a completely unreflective person, and so that, made it very frustrating. And so I didn't have to grapple with that, for better or for worse. I didn't get to interview Ronald Reagan. He died long before I began this project. So I didn't have to worry about that, and I could, get to know him in other ways, including talking to people who knew him, reading things that were written about him. I mean, just even, great insights into his childhood just from reading, the Dixon Evening Telegraph, for example, which is now available on newspapers.com, which is a miraculous website. And so you can actually read with great detail and fidelity what was actually happening around him as he was growing up, and which is completely at odds with this very rose-colored, idealized version of his childhood as being like a Huck Finn idol, as he once wrote, which itself is kind of a bizarre description because Huck Finn's life was not an idol by any stretch, but that's another, leave that aside. But so, I talked to roughly 100 people who knew him, and none of them, very few of them would say that they were close to him because nobody was really close to him, but it still adds up to people who really knew him, and it adds up to a very complex picture. And I think what my main takeaway, in contrast to maybe what Edmund or others thought, was that although he was often accused of having simplistic views, he was not a simple man. There were actually great depths to him, which you could discover.
So in essence, it's easier for the biographer to write about the dead than the living.
Yeah, there could be some truth to that. I mean, it depends on who it is,
So your book strikes me as critically empathetic, and meaning that I think you see a decent, if slightly, not vacuous, but he's in his own little universe. But you don't hesitate to confront his failings. And, it's a long list. I'm going to briefly go through like a half dozen. I mean, the 1969 Berkeley police riot that took place when he was governor, the racism, the dog whistles. He's caught on tape in 1971 in the Nixon White House calling African diplomats monkeys. There's, the hiring of Lee Atwater and the running of that campaign that was, had racist tinges. His failure to confront a pandemic, AIDS. The October surprise was one of my favorite because I had to write about that in my Jimmy Carter biography. The debate gate, again, the stolen debate briefing books. Iran-Contra. And Lebanon, which is now in the news again, his 1983 indecision about how to handle Lebanon. The 1985 car bomb attack in Lebanon by the CIA. You call it most shameful. Given all these failures and misjudgments, why are historians, you think, still counting Reagan's presidency as consequential?
Well, I think it was definitely consequential, even if you think that he was a failure. I think he was a consequential failure, but I actually think that despite his many failures, overall his presidency was a success. I mean, there's a reason why in the C-SPAN poll of presidential historians a few years ago, Reagan was ranked, I think, number 9. So that's pretty good out of all the presidents that we've had. And I think there are reasons for that. Again, I don't, in the book, I certainly don't gloss over his failures or his shortcomings, some of which you listed. There are actually others. But I basically wind up endorsing the judgment of the historians that he was, one of the most consequential and successful presidents. And I think the reasons why he was consequential, at a meta level, it had to do with the fact that although he was somebody who was intensely ideological and believed a lot of things that were just not so. And as I show in the book, he was actually much more under the sway of, John Birch Society propaganda and other right-wing conspiracy theories than people had realized. So he was very much, he said a lot of things that were just not so, and he had a very cavalier attitude towards the truth. He was a terrible manager. There's a lot of, he catered to, white backlash politics. There's a lot of things you can hold against him. But I think at the end of the day, what made him a successful governor and president was that he was fundamentally a pragmatist, and he was able to pivot to the center and govern in a fairly moderate way. For example, as governor of California, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country. He signed a tough gun control bill. He raised taxes and spending, and although he demonized, universities as hotbeds of hippies and outlaws, he increased funding for the higher education by like 136%. I actually asked, Jerry Brown, who was the son of Pat Brown, who Reagan defeated in the 1966 gubernatorial race, and of course, Reagan's successor as governor. I asked Jerry Brown, what do you think of Ronald Reagan as governor? And his answer was, Reagan was a pretty good governor. By the way, Willie Brown, the longtime Democratic Speaker of the California Assembly, said the exact same thing to me. Pretty good governor. So that's kind of an unexpected verdict, and I think you can render a similar verdict on his presidency. Again, despite its many failures, including ignoring the AIDS pandemic, that was inexcusable. But I think he got a few big things right, and I think one of the big things he got right was he really restored the nation's spirit and morale after the tumultuous 1970s, after Watergate, Vietnam, stagflation, Iran hostage crisis, all the rest of it. He understood how to communicate as effectively as any president in the media age, and really, I think, had a very positive vision of America as a shining city on a hill, often not a realistic or accurate vision, but it was a very uplifting vision, I think, that people bought into, and that helped America to leave aside some of the traumas of the 1970s. And I think the other one, which we can talk about perhaps in more depth, is the role that he played in ending the Cold War, which I think has often been misunderstood and mythologized, and it's very different from what his admirers claim it is, but nevertheless, he did play an important role in working with Mikhail Gorbachev to help end the Cold War, and I think that in itself is enough to label him as a president who got big things done.
Well, I'm particularly interested in your comments about his sunny optimism. This is why he won the 1980 election against Jimmy Carter, who was sort of sermonizing about America's ills. And he didn't use the word malaise, but Jimmy Carter was all about looking at the hypocrisies in American politics, the inadequacies, our materialism, and along comes this sunny Hollywood movie actor who's talking about what a great place America is. So that explains the 80 election, I think. So for a moment, let's go back to his roots and his own political odyssey. It's extraordinary. He grew up in this small town. He in the 1930s, he's an admirer of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. And yet by the late 1940s, he's an FBI informant, number T10. So explain that odyssey.
Well, I think this is actually one of the most important episodes in Reagan's life, how it was that he went from being this New Deal Democrat who idolized FDR and voted for FDR 4 times to, by the early 1960s, becoming a very right-wing Republican who made his national political debut speaking on behalf of Barry Goldwater in 1964. And the way that Reagan explained it was completely inaccurate, because he often said, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to suggest that somehow the Democratic Party had lurched to the left and he was left standing in the center. Completely inaccurate. It might have been an explanation that had some credibility if he had become a Republican in 1972, and he could have said, is that George McGovern and those hippies made me a Republican? But that's not the case at all, because he became a Republican, a very conservative Republican, in the 1950s, when the Democratic Party itself was pretty conservative. Remember, the dominant Democrats in the 50s were Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. In 1960, John F. Kennedy ran to Richard Nixon's right on defense policy. So the Democratic Party was very centrist. They were, blockading Cuba. They were sending troops to Vietnam. This was not some left-wing pacifist party. It was Ronald Reagan who changed, not the Democratic Party. And looking at, so you really have to ignore what he said about himself and look to other evidence to piece together his ideological transformation. And I suggest in the book that it began in World War II, when he was an officer in an Air Force propaganda unit, but he was still, he was a very highly paid actor in Hollywood, did not enjoy having to pay taxes at a 90% level, which was the wartime rate of taxation. So that began his move to the right, but then it accelerated in the late 40s when his movie career waned and he became more active in Hollywood politics. He became a union leader, eventually president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he became, as you suggested, very active in these battles over so-called Reds in Hollywood, and he came to believe that there was a communist takeover that he was thwarting in Hollywood. Now, as I try to show in the book, I think this was mainly a fiction, that there were communists in Hollywood, but there wasn't some made-in-the-Kremlin plot to take over Hollywood, which would have been impossible in any case. But he became, an FBI informant. He testified before the House On-American Affairs Committee. He became very influenced by some of the paranoid right-wing views of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Also people like Luella Parsons, the very influential gossip columnist who was very close to Reagan, also very right-wing and very paranoid, anti-communist. And then his transformation really accelerated in the 1950s when his movie career having disappeared altogether, he found a new lease on professional life as the host of General Electric Theater Sunday nights on CBS, and also as a spokesman for GE. And GE in those days was a very right-wing company that actively proselytized its employees with right-wing propaganda because they saw this as a way to inoculate themselves against union trouble. So Ronald Reagan would take these long train rides in the 50s from LA to New York because he was afraid of flying in those days. And he had a lot of time on the train to read a lot of the right-wing propaganda that GE foisted on its employees. And then he would kind of digest it and then use it in his own speaking on behalf of the company. And so that was really the period when he became very doctrinaire, very right-wing, and it was very far to the right by the early 1960s.
So I was really fascinated by one anecdote you tell in the book, your account of Reagan's encounter with a Jesuit priest named Father George Dunn. And, he leapt to the conclusion that this Jesuit priest was being manipulated by communists. He had no evidence for this.
And he held that conclusion for the rest of his life. And there was a very funny anecdote that I tell in the book from the 1981 Group of Seven summit in Canada, where Reagan starts reminiscing about how the KGB recruited this Catholic priest in Hollywood, and how he found him out and had him ejected from the Hollywood, and all the other world leaders were like sitting around saying, "What the hell is he talking about?" And this was this crazy myth because Father Dunn was taught at a Catholic university in LA. He was kind of, he was certainly a liberal, but he was no communist. But he was somebody who reported on and got involved in labor disputes in Hollywood. And there was one big labor dispute between two craft unions in Hollywood, trying to, that were vying to represent the craftsmen who worked behind the scenes in movies. And one of the unions was mobbed up, very corrupt and very close to the studios, and basically in the pocket of the studios. And the other union was not mobbed up and was kind of more militant in its union's activity. And so, the studios and the mobbed up union tried to paint the more militant union as being part of a communist takeover of Hollywood. And, Father Dunn reported on this for Commonweal Magazine and others and showed this was not the case at all. And so then Reagan got into his head that the reason why Father Dunn was saying this was not the case was because he was actually a Soviet agent himself, and they had this farcical confrontation where, Reagan wouldn't listen to anything that Father Dunn said, and then basically the studios used their influence with the Catholic Archdiocese to get Father Dunn sent off to Phoenix, far away from Hollywood, and Reagan kind of reveled in that. But it was a weird, it was that was part of kind of a lifetime of jumping to conclusions based on facts, not in evidence.
As one of his children once said, he makes things up and then believes them. But one of the weird things about his political trajectory is that he moves to the right in the 1950s, sort of at the height of the McCarthy period. But he continues moving to the right even after the Army McCarthy hearings are over in 1954 and Joe McCarthy is discredited, and the consensus moves dramatically in the other direction, but not Ronnie.
No, and he became friends in the 50s with Bill Buckley, the founder of National Review, and Buckley, of course, was a staunch defender of Joe McCarthy and the whole, and also of the House Un-American Affairs Committee long after they had been discredited. So, Reagan continued moving to the right, and as I found evidence, as I uncovered for the book, that even as late as the early 1970s, he was reading publications by John Birch Society members of their crazy conspiracy theories about this communist cabal trying to take over the United States, and he thought that they had a lot of credence.
Okay, so nevertheless, he has a successful political career, and one of the themes in your book is that he's actually good at governing when he abandons or walks away from his hardline ideology. And this is pragmatism, and so this is one of the themes of your biography, that pragmatism was he could engage in pragmatism despite of the ideology. And this is becomes clear in his dealings with Gorbachev, where he, this lifelong anti-communist, the man who, talks about tearing down the Berlin Wall, the evil empire, all of that, he nevertheless is able to establish a relationship with Gorby. And yet, there's a moment in your book where you describe how emotionally awkward Ronnie is in his meetings with Gorbachev. And he tells this outlandish joke about a taxi driver and leaves poor Gorby stunned at the inappropriateness of it.
He had a whole storehouse of anti-communist jokes, which I guess he didn't think that Gorbachev might not appreciate it. But
And then he has this moment in Iceland where they almost get rid of all nuclear weapons. And yet he can't do it because ideology sticks. And Gorby is listening to his scientists and comes to the conclusion that, Star Wars, SDI would be a waste of money and foolish and never practical. But Ronald Reagan can't listen to the scientists, can he? He's convinced of this possibility and gives up this opportunity to do what Robert Oppenheimer wanted to do, which was to ban the bomb.
Reagan certainly was prone to enthusiasms in the face of evidence otherwise, and I think the two big enthusiasms of his presidency, one were for tax cuts, and he was convinced, despite all economic evidence to the contrary, that tax cuts would pay for themselves by stimulating so much economic activity that the federal government would not actually lose money from cutting taxes. And so he wound up expressing regret that he increased the deficit, but that was utterly predictable given the size of his tax cuts and his spending increases. His other major enthusiasm was for abolishing nuclear weapons, or more accurately perhaps, for saving the world from nuclear Armageddon. And this was something that people didn't realize at the time because, he was, for example, an opponent of the nuclear freeze, and people didn't understand why that was, and he was often caricatured as being this crazy right-wing warmonger. But there were really two reasons why he opposed the nuclear freeze. One was it was one-sided. It was only the U.S. that was going to freeze, not the Soviet Union. But the other reason he opposed it, which people didn't realize, was he thought the nuclear freeze didn't go far enough. He didn't want to freeze nuclear weapons at their existing levels. He wanted to abolish nuclear weapons, which people did not realize at the time. And that accounted for his enthusiasm for the Strategic Defense Initiative, because he thought this could be a way to basically render nuclear weapons useless and to protect the world from Armageddon. And just as with tax cuts, there were a handful of kind of eccentric economists like Robert Mundell and Art Laffer who were telling him that tax cuts would pay for themselves. So too in the case of missile defense, there were a handful of kind of eccentric scientists, of whom the most prominent was Edward Teller, who were telling him that things like you could put this dozens of lasers in space, and they would shoot down all ballistic missiles, and so create this space shield against nuclear weapons. And I think in one of those brainstorms, these space lasers would actually be nuclear powered. They would be shooting down, nuclear weapons down below. So, I think serious scientists, including, the experts at the Pentagon, said that this was fantasy. This was never going to happen, and in fact, it never has happened. We've spent countless billions of dollars and still have not achieved that objective. But he was very devoted to it and insisted on it in the face of evidence to the contrary. And ultimately, that was what led to the failure of the Reykjavik summit in 1987, where Reagan and Gorbachev were actually talking about this audacious plan to abolish all nuclear weapons within 10 years, but Reagan would not give up the development and testing of SDI as a precondition for that. And so they left the summit in failure, but it was only a temporary failure, because the next year they met in Washington and signed a treaty abolishing intermediate-range nuclear weapons, which was a landmark accord and a major step towards ending the Cold War.
Right. So let's get to the current situation. Did Reagan sort of pave the way for what we could loosely call the Trump era today?
Well, yes and no. There are certainly major differences between Reagan and Trump, and I would argue that the differences are greater than the similarities. Remember, Reagan was somebody who was pro-free trade, pro-immigration. He actually signed a bill in 1986 that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. He was pro-allies, pro-NATO, pro-standing up to Russian aggression. He had a very sunny, optimistic view of America. He would never describe the United States as a failing country, as Trump does multiple times a day. So I think the differences are greater than the similarities, but there are continuities, and you can kind of see the through lines in the fact that, Reagan was also a populist. He even used the slogan, "Make America Great Again." He denigrated the federal government. One of his regular quips was, the scariest words in the English language are, "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you," which was kind of, he didn't thunder on about the deep state, but with this kind of witty, understated manner, he nevertheless, decreased popular faith in the federal government. He also, his policies exacerbated income inequality and thus led to populism on both the left and the right, which Trump now exploits. And certainly, as we've been discussing, he also, appealed to white backlash politics, even though he did it more subtly than Trump did. And he was also prone to, repeating faux facts, saying things that simply were not true, even though he never claimed that, immigrants were eating people's pets. But he said a lot of other things that were not true. So you can see some continuities. Trump did not emerge from nowhere. In fact, what I would say in general is that basically, ever since 1964 and the nomination of Barry Goldwater, the Republican Party has been going further and further to the right, and each generation of Republicans further to the right than the one before. And so Reagan was further to the right than Ford and Nixon. Trump, in turn, is further to the right than Reagan. And so the ultimate irony here is that in 1980, when Reagan won the presidency, his election was rightly seen as moving the party and the nation to the right. Reaganism was moving America to the right. Today, if the Republican Party adopted Reaganism, they would actually be moving to the left. They would be returning to the center. That's kind of the grand historical irony, I think.
So in a weird way, I'd like to offer the notion that maybe the roots of Trumpism goes back to Joe McCarthy more than it does to actually Reagan.
Well, I mean, you can kind of keep pushing it back as far as you want, really, because you can also point to the right in the 1930s. I mean, remember, America First was a slogan used by Charles Lindbergh in the America First Committee before World War II, and that's a slogan that Trump himself has picked up. There was a far right, or not even far right. There was the right, the isolationist right in the 1930s, and small government isolationist right, which was discredited by the Great Depression and World War II, and then was kept at bay in the 1950s when Dwight Eisenhower won the Republican nomination over Robert Taft. But I think you can argue that now, at the end of the Cold War, the end of the war on terrorism, it's that old pre-war far right that has kind of come roaring back. But I think it's really basically, at least since 1964, that the right has increasingly been in control of the Republican Party, kind of in the post-Eisenhower era.
So let's go back for the few minutes we have remaining to biography, to the man. We haven't spoken about his wife, Nancy, his second wife. But when he got divorced from his first wife, Jane, you say that he was apparently pretty clueless about how unhappy she was.
Yeah, I mean,
Came as a surprise.
Yeah, again, this is one of the interesting things I discovered, because Ronald Reagan was very good at reading an audience, very good at communicating with the nation and the world, but he didn't have actual great empathy for people around him, didn't really understand their feelings. And so, for example, he was shocked when his first fiancée, Margaret Cleaver, who was his high school and college sweetheart, broke up with him. He had no idea that it was coming. And likewise, he was shocked in the late 40s when Jane Wyman, his wife, decided to break up with him. It hit him, out of nowhere. He had no idea how unhappy that she was. And so, yes, he was not terribly empathetic, and he also, that's part of the reason why he really had almost no close friends. He was actually, on TV, he came across as very avuncular, genial, friendly, but people who actually knew him and told me that, he was actually, very remote and
his own children
not close to anybody,
sort of
really.
felt he didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. His own
hard to
children,
get to
among
know.
others, yeah.
So you suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, Nancy got pregnant in order to force Ronald to propose. Do you think?
Well, I mean, the evidence for that is inconclusive. I mean, Patty Davis believes that to be the case, because Nancy was pregnant with Patty, but, and there is some evidence to indicate that. I mean, I looked at it pretty closely and basically said it's possible, but I can't prove it. But there's no question that Ronald Reagan hated to commit, and he hated, it took Jane Wyman had to wage a years-long campaign to get Reagan to marry her, and doing stuff like pretending that she enjoyed riding horses and so forth, and Nancy did the exact same thing after Jane divorced him, and Nancy set her eyes on him and thought this was the man she wanted to marry. But he was happy to date her, but he didn't really want to get hitched again because he was traumatized by the divorce. So Nancy had to wage this campaign to get him to go to the altar. And part of it was, again, pretending that she loved going to the ranch, loved riding horses and all that kind of stuff. But then finally she was getting frustrated and finally, gave him an ultimatum saying like, hey, I have a job offer to be on Broadway. I'm going to move to New York unless something changes here. And then the speculation is that she may have also gotten deliberately pregnant, whether deliberately or not. She definitely got pregnant, and so they had to hurry the marriage, and that was how they...
So it was a long marriage, a very close partnership, and she was highly influential in his political career, maybe his closest political advisor in some respects, but he sometimes defied her, ignored her advice. And she comes off as a little I don't know, brittle. Did you like Nancy?
I mean, I would say she wasn't necessarily the most likable person, but I think she was a hugely important person to his life. I mean, I had Reagan aides who told me he would have never become governor and president if it hadn't been for Nancy Reagan. And that wasn't because she had any great political ambitions. She really didn't. Her only ambition was to help her husband and to make Ronnie happy. But once he set out to become this political figure, she did what it took to make that happen. And, she was very useful to him because her personality type was very different. I mean, aside from the fact that she was utterly 110% devoted to him as he was to her, Reagan was very trusting, naive, kind of assumed everybody had the best of intentions, whereas Nancy was sort of the opposite. She was very jittery, suspicious, worried a lot, assumed that people were out to get him unless proven otherwise. And so she kind of played that, as one of the Reagan aides said to me, she was kind of the HR department of Reagan Inc. She hired and fired on his behalf, and he really needed that because he hated personality conflicts. He wouldn't get into people's faces. He wouldn't fire them, but she was more than happy to do that, and she inspired real fear among his aides. But she was kind of his enforcer, and I think every successful politician needs somebody who's their enforcer.
She was the tough rock.
She was the tough one, yeah.
So I know everyone is always curious to know the question about Alzheimer's. I think you in the book decidedly reject the notion that he had any signs of Alzheimer's while he was in the White House. That yes, he was slowing down and that it was old age and he's becoming less energetic. And
yeah, I mean, I talked to his neurologist, among other people, who suggested to me that, from what I understand, I mean, I'm certainly no doctor, but he is. But that the underlying conditions of Alzheimer's, the plaques and whorls in the brain, form years before you suffer dementia and feel their effects. And so, almost certainly, as president, he had those conditions in his brain, but there is no evidence that I could see that he actually had dementia when he was in office. And I asked a lot of people about this, looked at his letters and sifted the evidence. So I don't think he had dementia when he was in office. I don't think he was suffering from senility, but there was no question that he was slowing down and he was less active towards the end of his second term than he was in his first. As you would expect, by the time he left office, he was almost 78 years old. And so a lot of decisions late in his second term were really being made by his senior aides, folks like George Shultz, Colin Powell, Ken Duberstein, Frank Carlucci, the senior folks in the administration. They would often get together and say, hey, let's figure this out among ourselves without going to the old man about it. And only if they disagreed about something would they take it to Reagan. But they were very, in contrast to early in the administration when the White House was, as Jim Baker memorably said to me, it was a rat, sorry for the language, but in contrast to the kind of backbiting in the White House, by the end of a second term, it was a very congenial, cohesive group, and so they were able to do a lot of things by themselves. And so I don't think that Reagan had dementia at that point, but he was definitely slowing down, and you could see that.
Right. So one of the sad parts in the book is when you write about his two only personal friends. That's how you describe it. And it's sort of shocking, but their names are Barney Barnett and Dennis LeBlanc. I'd never heard of them. Describe who these people are and what was the nature of their relationship.
Well, that was one of my most fascinating interviews for the book, talking to Dennis LeBlanc, who nobody's ever heard of, as you said. But Dennis LeBlanc and Barney Barnett were both California state police officers who protected Reagan when he was governor of California. And then after he left the governorship, they were basically his ranch hands on his ranch near Santa Barbara. And they were, when I talked to Reagan's longtime personal secretary, Kathy Osborne, and I said, Kathy, who do you think were President Reagan's best friends when he was in office? And she pointed to Dennis and Barney as probably being his best friends, these two blue-collar former cops. And Reagan loved spending time with them on the ranch. They would, chop wood, they would ride horses, paint fences, do all the, kind of ranch work, which is what he loved most. And they wouldn't talk about politics. They would, as as Dennis LeBlanc said, we would talk about family stuff, we would talk about guy stuff. He would just like to get his hands dirty and be one of the guys. And at the end of the day, the three guys would go back to the ranch house where Nancy Reagan's housekeeper would prepare a meal for them, and she never cooked. The housekeeper prepared the meal. But it was a very stingy meal because she was always watching her weight, making sure everybody around them was watching their weight too. And then, so they would have, a very, very small meal, and then they would all settle down in front of the couch together and, watch Murder, She Wrote or some other show, and then kind of fall asleep watching the TV. And then, at some point, Nancy would kind of nudge them and say, "Time to go to bed, guys." And so Barney and Dennis would shuffle off to their trailer where they slept, and Nancy and Ron would go off to their very modest bedroom in their very modest ranch house. And this is where Reagan was the happiness. So I thought it was actually, you said it was sad, but I think there was actually something kind of sweet and nice about it that, he hobnobbed with world leaders and all these moguls, the Walter Annenbergs and Alfred Bloomingdales and other people, but that wasn't what he really enjoyed doing. What he really enjoyed doing was hanging out with these two blue-collar guys just doing ranch work and
You're right.
very modest.
It is sweet, but it's sort of sad that he couldn't connect with most people in his personal life. But anyway, so Reagan, his life and legend is now on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a tremendous achievement. It took you 10 years. And I'm just wondering, my last question is, have you gotten any sort of feedback or blowback or criticism from the MAGA Republicans or Reagan's inner circle, or?
I haven't. Maybe it's coming, but I haven't seen it so far. The feedback. Some of the most meaningful feedback I've gotten has been from Patty and Ron, the two kids who read the book, and not only said it was accurate, but also said they learned stuff about their father from it. So I took that to be a very
that's the
high
highest
endorsement.
compliment, for a biographer, absolutely. Well, congratulations, Max, and I think we now have time for questions.
Thanks very much. Could you talk a little bit more about his time as an FBI informer in Hollywood? Did he have a lot of contact with Hoover? And I'm also interested in his relationship with Nixon, who I assume he knew when Nixon was vice president, and I believe Nixon even advised Reagan when he was president. And finally, could you give a little background on the '76 campaign? Did Reagan really think he had a chance at the beginning when he started the run?
That's a lot of questions. Yes, he was an it was interesting because Reagan actually testified before the House On-American Affairs Committee when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he actually got very good reviews, even from liberal writers, because he took a very moderate stance in front of HUAC, saying, he refused to name names. He said that he didn't know if the Communist Party should be illegal. He was worried about infringements on civil liberties. So it was actually a very, kind of down the middle type of stance. But in private, he was actually much more hardline and told FBI agents in private that the Communist Party should be illegal. He named names and provided information from the SAG rolls of people that were suspected of being communists who were driven out of the business, blacklisted. So, and he developed great respect for J. Edgar Hoover, which was not unusual in those days. Hoover was a very popular guy before his infringements on civil liberties became widely known. And so he listened very closely to J. Edgar Hoover and kind of picked up some of the paranoid anti-communism of Hoover. And also, for example, Hoover thought that Martin Luther King was a closet communist, and Reagan gave indications that he thought the same. So he was certainly very influenced by Hoover and his kind of paranoid right-wing views. The second question was about Nixon. He changed his mind about Nixon as his ideology changed. In the late 40s, early 50s, when he was still a Democrat, he thought Nixon was Tricky Dick and a guy you couldn't trust and somebody who should not be elected to office. But by 1960, he was on a first-name basis with Nixon and, in fact, head of Democrats for Nixon. And the only reason he was still a Democrat was because Nixon asked him to remain a Democrat. He had a huge respect for Nixon, such that he couldn't believe that Nixon did anything wrong during Watergate. He was shocked when he had to resign in '74. I would add, by the way, that Nixon did not reciprocate the respect, because if you listen to the White House tapes, you can hear Kissinger and Nixon chortling over how dumb they thought Reagan was and how he didn't know anything, but they had respect for his political prowess and felt compelled to keep him happy. But it was kind of a one-sided respect that Reagan kind of admired Nixon. Nixon did not so much admire Reagan, but he was happy to provide advice to him during his presidency. And then what happened was, Reagan thought that it was such a staunch Nixon supporter. He thought that Nixon would serve out his second term, leave in '76, and Reagan, as the former governor of California, would step in as the Republican nominee. And so he was shocked when Nixon had to resign. Gerald Ford becomes president, and Reagan did not have any respect for Ford. He thought he was basically an accidental president, and he was usurping Reagan's position as next in line. And so that's why he launched his audacious bid against Ford in the 1976 primaries, where he actually came very close to unseating Ford.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. This has been very interesting. I only have two quick questions. The first is, I was wondering if you could flesh out your feelings about, the notorious, I think it was the Neshoba County Fair, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Reagan famously didn't say anything, after what had happened there, the degree to which that was kind of something that he really was doing deliberately. And then the second, just like, regarding your comments about how the Republicans have moved further and further to the right, to what degree would you say that Trump has actually moved the party to the left? That is to say, his rhetoric is extremely, I guess offensive, but, his protection of entitlements and, the idea that we need to put up trade barriers to protect American workers and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I guess I was just curious to hear your opinion about that particular change. Thank you.
Well, let me start with the Neshoba County Fair, which was where Reagan went in August of 1980 after the Republican convention and gave a speech to the Neshoba County Fair, just a few miles where these civil rights workers had been slain in 1964, and he used that phrase, states' rights, which of course was code in the South for opposition to civil rights. And that's gotten a lot of focus in recent years, and but I would argue it's actually not that unexpected because it's part of a pattern going back to his first political campaign in 1966 for governor of California. He ran against the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which Pat Brown had supported, which was legislation to bar discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. He was opposed to the 64 Civil Rights Act. He was opposed to the 65 Voting Rights Act. He was opposed to school busing. When he was asked about civil rights protests and civil disobedience, he said there was no excuse for breaking the law. He talked about welfare queens. He talked about law and order. He used a lot of these coded phrases, which were ostensibly neutral, but got the message across, to white voters that he was somebody who was opposed to, civil rights legislation. And I think the message about states' rights was only kind of the most notorious example of that in 1980. And it's hard to know what he was thinking, as Edmund Morris and others discovered. But I know when I asked Stu Spencer, who was one of my best sources and had been Reagan's political consultant all the way back to 1966, masterminded all of Reagan's winning campaigns. And I asked Stu if Reagan understood what was meant by the phrase states' rights. And Stu said, he wasn't a dummy. He understood. And he was very deliberately using that, even though, as he often said, there is not a trace of bigotry in my heart. But whatever was in his heart, there is no question that he was pandering to bigoted politics.
Hello.
I'm sorry, what was the Trump question?
I don't know whether Trump is actually kind of moving onto the left.
I mean, that sort of depends on a fairly artificial distinction of what is left and right. I mean, he certainly moved them away from a small government agenda, but I would argue he's kind of a populist nationalist who embraces big government, embraces tariffs, but which is antithetical to a free market conservatism. And I would say that is part of a right-wing agenda, but it's certainly not part of a laissez-faire free market agenda.
You briefly discussed Nancy's impact on Reagan's political career. How would you say that Nancy impacted the role of the First Lady?
Well, she was certainly not the first impactful First Lady. I mean, there were a lot. I mean, you think about Eleanor Roosevelt, you think about Lady Bird Johnson, you think about Rosalind Carter, I mean, there were a lot of very powerful first ladies, and I think she was kind of part of a line of very powerful first ladies, who was a very important advisor behind the scenes and really pushed for pragmatic, moderate policies, not because so much she had any political agenda of her own, but because she wanted her husband to be successful and didn't want him to listen to ideologues or extremists. But at the same time, she kind of cultivated a very saccharine image, often derided for her, redecorating the White House, ordering White House china, and then ultimately mocked for, relying on an astrologer. So, she, and I think Nancy Reagan was really pained by her negative public perception, whereas Reagan could kind of shrug off criticism. That was one of his superpowers. He didn't care that much when he was attacked, but it really got to Nancy Reagan. So it was, being in Washington, I think, was a very painful experience for her.
Thank you.
One more?
Yes, I would like to comment on Kuiper. I love the way you interview. I wish you had a TV show or you had a podcast because I love the questions you ask.
And I'd never have time to write.
Don't care about that. I love the way you interview. But for Max Boot, I would like you to speak more about, after Jimmy Carter, I think the nation had a very low self-image because of the hostages in Iran. I think Reagan restored our pride as Americans, and I would like if you could just address that, how he restored our pride as Americans, how he restored that quality of being a righteous American.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. He had tremendous faith in America, perhaps excessive, you could argue, or unwarranted faith, but he had it, and he kind of communicated that faith very effectively. And he was, even long after he left behind FDR's New Deal politics, he was still very influenced by FDR's model of the presidency. I mean, he was one of those millions of Americans who was listening to the fireside chats in the 1930s and learning this is how you communicate so effectively. And he was truly a master communicator. And it wasn't just a question of reading speeches off a teleprompter, although he did that very well, but it was also crafting the message. And, again, Stu Spencer, one of my most incisive interview subjects, said Reagan was not just the best speech giver that he knew, but also the best speech writer. And of course, for decades before entering the White House, he wrote his own speeches. He put them on index cards, he shuffled the cards around, he looked at the audience reaction, he saw what worked, what didn't work. So he was very good at communicating.
And his diaries were well written too, right?
No.
No?
He was a beautiful letter writer. His diary I actually found to be pretty boring, and it was very perfunctory, not interesting at all. But his letters, actually, I've read pretty much all his letters, and he was actually a beautiful letter writer. It was actually a pleasure to read his letters because he could communicate whatever the emotion was, whether it was sympathy or congratulations or whatever it was. He could do it very succinctly and very powerfully, and he always just found the right tone to strike. So he was actually, his diary wasn't interesting. His 2 ghostwritten memoirs were terrible, nothing like what he actually sounded like. But he was a very powerful communicator with a microphone, a very good letter writer, and he had a genuine appreciation for the pageantry of the presidency, which I think is an area where people like Jimmy Carter were not as adept. And Reagan was once asked, how could an actor be president? And his reply was, I don't understand how anybody but an actor could be president.
Well, in defense of Jimmy Carter, he was not a great communicator. But
That's your defense of him?
But in defense of him, what he was saying was actually prescient. He was sort of a prophet in the wilderness.
No, I don't dispute that, but Americans don't necessarily want a prophet in the White
They
House.
don't want a prophet in the White House, and so Carter was very much, as the title of my biography, he was very much an outlier. Anyway, Max, this has been great.